Shalom, everyone. I would like to talk today about the question that I believe bothers many people, and that is why did the Haredi community, the ultra Orthodox, and even some among the Orthodox community, why did it react to the regulations and the restrictions of the coronavirus the way it did? Why did they refuse to believe and to follow the regulations at the beginning? Why did they continue to hold minyanim, prayers, engagement parties, kiddushim? Even now, this week, the New York Times published an article revealing that in many places in Brooklyn and Borough Park, schools are operating underground. People are letting kids into synagogues where they study in groups against regulations. How is this happening? Is this just ignorance? Is this just complete apathy to the rest of the world? Where did this come from? I believe that the roots of the problem are very deep, and I want to highlight some of them today. I want to break it into two categories. One is the category of myths, and the other is the category of social phenomena. When I say myth, I don't mean something which is false, which is not true, but rather an idea that has developed over time, usually an ideological idea that connects people in the present to events and people in the past. People identify with a certain concept that goes all the way back to ancient times. Sometimes it could be the creation of the world or the destruction of the temple or one of our struggles against our enemies. There are five of those myths that I want to refer to today, and they are a Torah study, the synagogue, the idea of Da'at Torah, the idea that we have to live in exile and persecution, and the idea that one should die to sanctify God's name. Now, I'll return to those later. I would also like to speak the second category is social phenomena. And those phenomena are, one, the margins reflect the center. Second, that we witness a rejection of science, technology, and the media. And third, that there is a silent consent by the government. And I'll explain later. Let's go back to the myths. I mentioned five of them: Torah study, the synagogue, Da'at Torah, persecutions, and Kiddush Hashem. Let's start with Torah study. What is the myth? The myth is that you have to study Torah day and night without cease. And to that we add the biblical personalities and the scholars of the Mishnah of the Talmud were all heads of yeshivot and all studied non-stop day and night. Also, to support that, people argue that from Rabbi Akiva to the Gur Hasidim in the Warsaw Ghetto and to modern-day Israel, where the government wanted several occasions to draft people to the army, the highest value was placed on public Torah study. This is the myth. But in reality, reading the Torah carefully will show that one should learn in order to apply in practice the laws of the Torah. The Torah was not given to scholars. The Torah was given to a nation of farmers, merchants, soldiers. The personalities of the Torah were shepherds and kings and warriors. And the scholars of the Torah, of the Mishnah and the Talmud, were also working people, of blacksmiths and shoemakers and carpenters and alcohol distillers. They had a wide variety of professions. What the Torah wants from us is that we would learn, and then we will be guided by those principles. What we've learned when we had time, we should apply to our life when we have to work. Whether you're a doctor or a lawyer, a carpenter, a teacher, a driver, whatever you are, you take the principles of the Torah that you've learned and you apply them to your life. Even those who study Torah all day, when their families start growing, they realize that they don't have the same amount of time. And I spoke to some of those people, and they were frustrated they can't learn Torah day and night. And I said, when you take care of your children and of your family and of your parnasa and of your income in the way the Torah wants you to do it, with civility, in an ethical way, with concern for others, you are learning Torah. This is what the Torah wants, not to sacrifice one's life for the ability to have a Torah class in the yeshiva. And we have to remember also that the story of Rabbi Akiva Makhil Kilot Barabim, gathering people to study Torah, that was not the reason he was killed by the Romans. He was really fighting for religious independence, religious autonomy, something that eventually failed. And even the Hasidim of Gur in the Warsaw Ghetto, it is true that in the beginning they were just learning Torah in the ghetto, but then they realized that they have to fight the Nazis, and they joined the war. They stopped learning. How is it the Midrash tells us that Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, and others were scholars of Torah? Very simple. That was the ideal that the rabbis tried to create at that time. So they projected on biblical personalities to convince people to do the same. The second myth is that of the synagogue. People think that the synagogue is the center of Jewish life. And this is across the border of Jewish institutions, from the ultra-Orthodox to the Orthodox and to other movements as well. How many people came to synagogue? How many events can we do to attract people, to bring people in? In reality, and I'm saying that as a community rabbi, for many, many years I had those discussions with the board members and others. They used to ask how many people come to the synagogue. And I would say, don't ask how many people came to the synagogue. Ask how much of the synagogue went home with the people. The synagogue is just a tool, a place for people to be inspired. Yes, it creates community and it's wonderful. But if you come to the synagogue, you have to be inspired. And you have to change, even a little bit, your life. Every day, a little bit. And if there's no change, your visit to the synagogue is worthless. We have to remember that the synagogue was created to replace the temple, to replace the sacrifices that were gone. The temple was visited only 3 times a year. You didn't bring sacrifice every moment. The center of Jewish life in biblical times was the home. It was in everyday life. The house is the real temple. The house is the real Mikdash. And this is what Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Haman, says in his introduction to Sefer Shemot. Unfortunately, the synagogue has become, for some people, a men's club or a refuge from the problems at home or in other places. And for some, even a way of religious pretense. Look at me. Look at my talit. Look at my lulav. Look how I shuckle during my tefillah. I'll tell you this. If one comes into the synagogue and leaves through the other door, or through the same door, without changing, it's better that he stays home. But if we don't understand that, if we think that the synagogue is the center of Jewish life, then there will be people who will be willing to risk their lives and the lives of others to keep having minyanim in public. But those people are no more than pagans. They're idol worshippers. They created an idol called the Bet Knesset, and they worship it at the cost of other people's lives. Then we have the myth of Dar Torah, the most dangerous myth that I think we have, maybe equal only to the idea of exile and persecution. And that's the idea that the rabbis can never be wrong and that they could rule on any subjects in the world. They could issue a psak on any subject. In reality, everyone can be wrong, and more than once. Read the Tanakh. Show me one person that was never wrong, that was never rebuked by God. Parashat Vayikra speaks about korbanot, sacrifices that people have to bring for an error. And who are those people? It's the president, the Nasi Hita, Kol Ha'ida, the leaders of the congregation, the high priest. Masechet Horayot in the Talmud Bavli discusses, and in the Mishnah and the both Talmudim speaks about a situation where the Sanhedrin makes an error. So of course the leaders can be wrong. To say that they can be wrong is to copy Christianity and the idea of infallibility of the Pope. The ability of the rabbis to judge should be limited to their area of expertise. A rabbi who knows nothing about medicine, about science, about ecology, about contagious diseases has no right to speak. The only thing he could say is listen to the experts. The term Dar Torah was originally invented in Poland by Agudat Israel for political purposes. They wanted to get into the Polish Senate, and they tried to convince the people to vote for them. But to take Dar Torah and say that the rabbi could rule for you, for the nation, on everything, this is another facet, another element of Avodah Zarah, unfortunately. The myth of exile and persecution is that Jews are condemned to live forever in exile and persecution until the coming of Mashiach. But in reality, we should not be waiting for Mashiach. We should bring Mashiach ourselves. And to bring Mashiach ourselves, that we have to do something beyond praying and beyond saying we are waiting for the coming of Mashiach. We have to actively change the world to make Mashiach come. And that is making the world better, caring about others, caring about the world, being responsible. The myth that we have to live in exile was created because of lack of choice. There was no other option. You lived persecuted, oppressed, and tortured by other nations. What are you going to say? How are you going to explain your situation? You say, this is God's will. Also, it was based on a misunderstanding of an ancient midrash that was created after the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Jews were fighting against the Romans for autonomy. The community in Eretz Israel was decimated, but they kept fighting. So the rabbi said, do not fight the Goyim. Do not fight the nations. Wait for Mashiach to come. Al ta'alu b'huma. Don't climb the wall. It was for a specific time where you really could not climb the wall. You couldn't go into Yerushalayim because it became a pagan city called Ilia Capitolina. And any circumcised person caught there would be put to death. The warning was issued for the 2nd, 3rd century, but people took it literally and applied it for 2,000 years and said, we have to sit and wait for Mashiach to come. We cannot fight the non-Jews. We cannot try to go to Eretz Israel. And unfortunately, before the Holocaust, Jews in Europe came to the rabbis and said, should we go to Israel? And the rabbis, based on this midrash, said, no, you should stay here. In Israel, you're going to become a heretic. You're going to abandon your religion. People said, so should we go to America? And the rabbi said, no, there the wealth will make you a heretic. You should stay here. People stayed, and we know what happened. But what happened after the Holocaust? The few voices who said that the rabbis were wrong were silenced. Some people just abandoned Judaism or the Haredi lifestyle altogether, but others stayed and decided to believe the rabbis because they couldn't admit that they were wrong and that the rabbi were wrong. So that level of denial is seated very deeply in the collective memory of the Haredi community. They were able after the Holocaust to say the rabbis were right. It had to happen this way. This is what God wanted. So if they say today you should go to Minyan and you should keep learning and everything will be okay, but then everything is not okay and people get sick, people say, okay, this is what God wanted. This is another dangerous myth. The last one that I wanted to mention is the idea of Kiddush Hashem, dying for Kiddush Hashem. The myth is that the highest value of a Jew, for a Jew, is to die for Kiddush Hashem. This is a myth that was born based on the story of the Akedah, but really created or perfected during the Roman persecution after the destruction of the temple, and then again in Germany during the Crusades. If you look at the story of the Akedah, Yitzhak eventually is not slaughtered. It was a message to Abraham that God is not interested in human sacrifices. But when Am Yisrael was attacked and when people were killed, the myth was created that this is what God wanted, the idea of martyrdom. And there was also, of course, an influence of Christianity. In reality, the highest value is to fight for the sanctity of life, to preserve human life. And that's why one should rather die than commit a crime only if he's going to harm another person. Yes, there's a concept of dying to not worship idols, but that is a deeper issue. And it was actually a mahloket. Rabbi Shmuel said that you should not die for idolatry. Pretend that you worship it and then survive. But it was outvoted. But even with that, we have an example of what happened in the Warsaw ghetto. I'm going back to this story. The Gur Hasidim, who decided to sanctify God's name and keep learning no matter what until the Nazis killed them, were told at a certain point by the Rabbi Menachem Zemba, he said, enough, we have to work on Kiddush Haim and not on Kiddush Hashem. But that myth is so deeply seated that there were people, I know of people who said, I'm going to the synagogue no matter what, and if I die, this is what God wanted. I will die for Kiddush Hashem. I died to sanctify God's name by going to the synagogue. So all these myths, when you put them together, the idea of the centrality of the synagogue, the importance of studying Torah day and night publicly, the idea of Da'at Torah, that the rabbis cannot be wrong and that you have to listen to them on every topic, the idea of exile and persecution, that there's always an enemy. There's always an enemy who's trying to destroy us. And if there's no enemy, we'll find one. So now, I failed to mention it before maybe, now that the virus is the enemy, what are you going to do? It's either a natural thing or God's hand. So the enemy is projected on the government. In Israel, when the police came to close synagogues, they were called Nazis. Why? Because the enemy had to be invented because of that myth. And the final one is the myth of Kiddush Hashem. Now let's talk about social phenomena. I said about that the margins reflect the center, right? We always hear the moderate center, mainstream orthodoxy saying, oh, those are marginal people. They don't represent us. But the truth is that the margin is only a margin in comparison to the center. The margins exaggerate the values which the center adheres to. So if the center thinks that the synagogue is the most important value of Jewish life, that you could never cancel a minyan, then the margin will take it to an extreme and will risk its life to maintain the minyan. If the center, the moderate center, uses violent language, a language of exclusion toward the LGBT community, then the margin will use physical violence against that community. The center cannot acquit itself of guilt, of responsibility, by saying we are moderate, they are fanatics. You have to re-examine your values and say, we have to educate people what is the right hierarchy, what is important, what is not. Second problem, second social phenomena that I think is extremely dangerous is the rejection of science, technology, and the media. This is something that came in waves. First, the threat of the evolutionary theory and biblical criticism. Evolutionary theory threatened the idea of the creation of the world. Biblical criticism threatened the idea that Torah is divine and given by God. Both of them led to the negation and total rejection of science and unbiased research. It led to a lack of confidence in science and, of course, a lack of confidence in technology, unless it serves you. But usually technology is seen as something that threatens the traditional way of life. And the media, of course, represents only the other non-observant public. So what is the result of that? What is the consequence? That when scientists tell people you have to stay home, religious people, by the way, not only Jews, religious people say, we don't believe you. You are scientists. You work against God. You work against the Torah. You work against revelation. Why would we listen to you? Technology is meant to destroy us unless we need it. And the media is left-wing, the other, whatever. We don't listen. So now people would say, okay, those are margins. They are uninformed. It's not my responsibility. The answer is, it is our responsibility. Because the government in Israel and in the United States, the government preferred to turn a blind eye to ultra-Orthodox education. A couple of years ago, people in Borough Park in Williamsburg sued the American government for failing to ensure that they get the right education. And this case was hushed. In Israel, it's even a more acute problem. Every time the government tries to impose core studies on the Orthodox community, they threaten demonstrations, disrupting the social order, going to war even, and the government eventually says, you know what, live your life, we'll live our life. You'll live in the state of Bnei Brak, we will live in the state of Tel Aviv. It doesn't work that way. The kids in the Orthodox community have no choice. They are indoctrinated by their parents. They have no access to science, technology, modern life. So they are brainwashed in a sense. When they grow up and they're being told, the government says that you have to do that because there is a health crisis, because scientists say that, and they say, oh, this is all nonsense. I've learned in school that the rabbi is always right, the Da'at Torah is always right, and the scientists are liars. So whose responsibility is at the end of the day? It's that of the government. It's that of the whole public. We can't say, oh, those are Orthodox people, we don't care about them. If we don't care about them, then their behavior is going to come back and kick us like it did. And I'm not using those labels to alienate certain people, because people could put on me also labels, Orthodox, Haredis, Faradis. I'm not using those labels in that manner. The way that people talk about them, I'm talking about the community that cuts itself off from modernity and scientific education. When they don't get this education, something like that happens, like the coronavirus shelter in home or other regulations, they say it doesn't apply to us. When it doesn't apply to them, they keep congregating, they keep gathering, they pass the virus on, and they affect everyone. So the inevitable conclusion is that it is a national and moral obligation, communal obligation, to ensure that everybody receives modern education, including core studies, and that they should be grounded in contemporary science and technology. And that it's a national and moral obligation for all streams and factions to unite and understand that when you live in one country, and now we live in the entire world together, we have a life of mutual commitment, and that we cannot dodge this responsibility for the sake of mankind and of our planet. I wish everyone Shabbat Shalom and Chodesh Tov, and keep safe and sane.